all they probably do is squeal, but chill. When we start the revolution, when we start the revolution, all they probably do is squeal, but chill. When we start the
we're talking again about why study history. So a lot of people think history is just a study of dates, you say, and reading information of things that happened in the past. That is certainly not the case. History in the human mind is always present. The past is always present. Things that happened to you at 1 year old, 2 year old, when you were 3 years old, are operating in you right at this moment. And the way you react to other people, the kind of taste you have, the desires you have, the kind of love relations you seek, and all of those kind of things are to a great extent determined by your experience before you were 3 or 4 years old. In other words, that experience, those experiences between birth and actually even in the womb itself, but between birth, 2 and 3 and 4 years old, operate right now to color your perception of other people, of yourself, to determine to a good degree the nature of your interaction with other people. In other words, then, the past is not something that's dead and gone and dropped off in your mind. It operates right here at this very moment, this very second, and it will operate until the day you die. And it's the same thing occurs in the history of a race. If you look at the history of a race, the way you look at an individual, those experiences that happened to us 200 and 300 years ago are not dead and gone by a long shot. The ways we relate to other people, many of our political goals today, many of our social goals right now, many of the things that we desire to achieve as a people come from our experience during slavery. Many of us are sitting here right now wanting to assimilate with white folk, wanting to be one. Many of us are struggling with feelings of inferiority and all of those kinds of things. Where did you think that started? You think it started here today? It started as soon as we hit the shores of this country. And so the experience of ourselves as a group is alive in us. Where else can history be alive but in the minds of people? If people were not in existence, what would be the point? We wouldn't even have to be discussing history. Another indication of the importance of history, of course, is the fact that those who rule over us and those who dominate us have worked very hard at distorting our history and at hiding our history from us and at falsifying our history. So if history were not that important to everyday life, to real life, and to concrete activities, why then has this nation and the people who rule it worked so hard to destroy African history? Why are they resisting the inclusion of African history and African culture in the educational structure if they think that that inclusion is purely harmless from their point of view, you see? In other words, then, we need to gain a new appreciation of history and need to recognize that history is always present. And that to a good extent, if we are to change our present behavior, and if we are to change the future, then we must change the past and change our relationship to it. And therefore, the falsification of and mislabeling of black consciousness deals with why we should study history. It deals with history as mythology. And you can recognize in your everyday behavior, if you've been given the wrong history about a person, how that can change your behavior toward that person. Earth people have a wrong history about you. They've been given the wrong information about you. People interact with other people based on their history of the other person, you see. If people want to change the nature of people's relationships, they will often falsify the history of one or both of those persons, knowing that one or both of those persons are going to interact with each other differently depending on their history or that sense of the history of the individual. This goes on with groups, ladies and gentlemen. That's why those in power then, you see, rewrite history. Because in rewriting history, they rewrite the person's perception of himself, whose history they've rewritten. They also then change that person's behavior and relationships with other people, given the history that they have come to believe. And they also change the way other people interact with those people, you see, based on the history that they've learned about the people, you see. That's why any group has to take command of its history and to make sure that it projects the kind of history that operates in its best interest. It cannot let another people write its history and let another people, you see, determine the nature of its history. And it must also know the history of other people as well, if it is to maintain self-control and self-determination, you see. But history is not a mere remembrance of experience. Everything we've learned in the past. You know, if you learned to talk, you learned to walk, and any other thing, you've learned it when? Not today. You learned it years ago. So if you, in a purely theoretical sense, forgot all of your history and all of your experience, you would return then to a fetal state of existence, to a state of immaturity. You would be reduced in your capacity to deal with current and present realities. Many of the coping techniques and things that you've learned in your past would not be useful to you because you would not have them at hand. The same thing is true then in the life of a people. We learned a lot of things as African people. We learned to cope with a lot of things. We learned a lot of methods and techniques for solving problems. The forgetting of African history, the not knowing of African history then, breeds in us a certain levels of immaturity and incapacities to deal with problems which confront us today. So you see, history is not a game of just remembrance. History is an instrument of power. And when you let another people, as I said earlier, falsify your history, they then will destroy your power and your potential as a people and your capacity to solve your problems as a people. So we're going to be talking about this. We're going to talk about how European history's mythology organized our mentality today as African people, and how we have to see European history as a mythology and get a more correct and realistic knowledge of European history as a way of getting a more correct and realistic knowledge of ourselves and as a way of getting in control of ourselves. We're also going to talk about, in that book, psychology. Why are we labeled as maladjusted and so forth? And why do we let another people place labels on us? Why do we let another people call our children learning disabled? Why have not we examined those definitions? To a very great extent, the destruction of our children is taking place because we have accepted without opposition or critical analysis the definition of other people of their behavior. A people who have falsified our history, do not know the psychology of our children nor us, but yet who are arrogant enough to feel that they can label our behavior and then impose programs on them. You must understand, you see, the labeling of behavior is not a mere designation of certain forms of behavior, but is a form of domination. So when you're permitted to label other people, you also are authorizing certain types of behavior toward those people. You're authorizing the withdrawal of certain rights. You're authorizing restraints and constraints on their behavior. You're authorizing, you see, the taking away of privileges and authorizing the imposition of all kinds of punitive and other so-called measures. So labeling children and labeling people's behavior is not something that should be taken easily, something that should be looked upon as purely the work of experts. No, as a people then, we must regain the capacity to label our own behavior and to deal with that behavior within our own context.